quickly get started. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the part of the world where you're joining us from or listening to this session deferred live. Um, Welcome to the Product Leaders Summit Virtual Speaker Series. We have another very interesting and different topic lined up for you today. I'm Mahit Bhalla, your MC for today. As a quick introduction, I have been in product management for a little over 15 years. As I like to tell people, this is who I've always wanted to be. I am not an accidental product manager. And I'm joined by my PLS Volunteer Speaker Series colleague Parul, who is an effective and emphatic product leader in her own right. So our goal at the PLS Speaker Series is to foster the new generation or the next generation of product leaders. We want to foster new speakers by giving them a platform to hone their craft. And we want them to bring in useful content. We want them to bring in the content that they seem being more effective in their product lives and their product careers and come and share it with all of you. So today we have an agenda. Of course, I'll get to the agenda next. We will do quick introductions. I already introduced myself and Parul. I'll be introducing Evan. We will be giving the floor to Evan, who wants to run through the deck quickly, and we want to allow more time for Q&A. We definitely want to engage our audience. We want Evan to share his wisdom beyond just the deck. And then we would also want to allow time for networking. We heard from the NPS surveys that all of the attendees really like networking and the breakout session. So we'll allow roughly 12 to 15 minutes for the breakout session and we'll bring it in to a close. Without further ado, let me introduce Evan. So, folks, please welcome Evan LaPointe. He is a true visionary in analytics and product innovation. He's worked and built key technologies for companies like Google, Adobe, but he's also founded Core to bring science and intentionality to teams and business performance, right? So, it's what we do should be more intentional. It shouldn't just be a flash in the pan. Evan has a deep track record in creating tools that empower teams and transform organization. He has a passion for clearing the path for people to do remarkable work. So it's not just him, but he truly thinks about people that he works with. So today he'll be sharing insights from his journey of building groundbreaking tools and teams that lead the industry. So with that, I'll be handing it over to Evan. Evan, please take it away.
All right. Nice to meet everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm really looking forward to this. I have two very simple goals personally for everybody today. Goal number one is I would really like to present a compelling argument and hopefully convince you that there is a better and simpler way of thinking about product and managing teams who think about product by just getting deeper down into how the brain actually works. So getting past the advice layer down into the thinking layer. And if I am successful in your mind in reaching that goal, then my second goal is to give you at least one or two tools that you can really grasp and put to use in the coming weeks with your team. Part of it's shared vocabulary. That's probably one of the most important things in a team, just to establish a way of intervening in all these little moments where things could go better or worse. But there are also just some pure educational tools and some pure kind of procedural tools that I want to share today. So we'll save some time for Q&A, and I'll try to get through my content fairly quickly, maybe not dwell on all the slides, because I think it'll be great to kind of put the buffet out in front of everybody, and then we can revisit stuff more deeply through the discussion in the Q&A, rather than me not giving you all that chance to ask questions, because some of this stuff, it's actually easier than it appears, and we misinterpret it as being complex. So sometimes the questions are a nice way to realize, no, it's really just this simple. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Rather than forgetting your questions as you go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we'll catch up in the chat after I finish presenting. That way you won't have to make your brain try to hang on to things all the way through. So with that, I'll just get started, and I will be sending this deck to everybody. I guess we do have a recording as well. So don't feel the need to screenshot or anything like that. Just try to kind of tune your brain into what's going on, and start letting those questions and those ideas form in your head. Okay, so I started a company called Core about 6 years ago after realizing that the business world doesn't actually understand human beings. We do a bunch of stuff in the business world that science knows isn't great. And I really love this quote from Dan Pink, that was out of his book Drive, that there is a mismatch between what science knows and what business does. And this quote kind of perfectly captures, we already know better, so why are we doing this? Right? I think it's just like there's so many opinions and theories. Adam Grant shares a lot of stuff. Ironically, he is a scientist and he does recommend a lot of stuff that science knows doesn't work that well. So it's really strange that we kind of are lost in so much theoretical and opinionated content in 2024 when we actually know so much. Now, it's not that surprising once I started digging through the science because it's actually pretty inaccessible sometimes. A lot of complicated parts of brains named and studies and stuff like that. So it's acceptable that like not everybody feels like spending their afternoon at the National Institute of Health website. But the truth is we know this stuff and we just have to synthesize it. I like the math formula. And I did, if you watch the Lenny's podcast episode, I did kind of articulate that in that episode, that you can turn this mismatch into a simple math formula, which is whatever you do in business that is different than what science knows basically equals all the inefficiency, dysfunction, mistakes, debt, tech debt, et cetera, that you accumulate as a business. So in that formula, the gap between what you do or what your business does and what science knows is where this stuff comes from. And it makes sense because like all the, inefficiency and dysfunction and mistakes and debt are all just us using our minds a little bit worse than we could be. And I don't mean like all mistakes, right? I mean the preventable ones. And we've all been around preventable mistakes where you're like, I cannot believe we're doing this right now. We all know that this is going to be a mistake and we're walking right into it. And when you think about like, what does this mean in kind of, I'm a kind of a visual thinker and learner. So I like this depiction of, well, what is the difference between what science knows and what business does? And what does that mean for us? So what science knows, we don't know everything. The scientific world doesn't know everything, but it's like saying that orthopedic surgeons don't know everything. They don't need to know everything to be unbelievably good. We don't need theories about how to do knee surgery. We have incredible scientific knowledge about how the process should be done, the sequence of things, how healing should work, how rehabilitation should work, et cetera. And that's what I mean when I say what science knows works best out of our available theories and knowledge and finger in the wind ideas. Science is kind of what is capable of designing the F-35 here, right? Like the most ideal design where every single contour of this jet is in exactly the right place. And when you put it through fluid dynamic simulations, it can tell any inefficiency on any part of the wing, any part of the fuselage, any part of the nose cone, any drag forces. All of that is known. And if some designer came in and stretched that wing out by an inch, they would immediately see formulaically that's actually a worse airplane, right? It's really cool, right? To think about it, it's that well designed within the parameters that we understand today. What business does instead is says, yeah, we've got a plane too. And they copy the Wright brothers plane. They're like, see, we can fly too. And you're like, that's not an F-35, right? And this is kind of what business does when business is copying best practices. They're crafting approaches that work for us. And then they rationalize these things and they say, oh, this is good enough. We don't need perfect. We have to start somewhere, right? Let's just build something super shitty. And then that'll help us get off the ground. And then we'll figure out the rest later, right? We can always change this later. And that rationalized behavior means that most businesses are using things that kind of technically work, But within the range of possibility, you're well below what you're truly capable of. And we feel that in product, especially not only internally in product, but systematically as we think about how we work in product with other teams cross-functionally and with our executive team and with finance and all these things. We have so much performance gap that's left over because of what we're doing. And then, of course, what business also does is stuff that just doesn't work. So businesses are definitely the one that we're going to focus on today is the very first bullet here, that businesses routinely drive system action mismatches in the human brain, meaning they activate a system in the brain, like the fight or flight response, and they expect actions that are creative and intellectual to occur with the wrong system activated in the human brain. Or they create a reward system activation by saying, we're going to do this, we're going to get bonuses, we're going to get promotions, we're going to make money. And then they expect actions that are purposeful, value creating to the consumer, et cetera, to occur. Those mismatches are physiological impossibilities. A human brain does not generate thinking from a different system while the wrong system is activated. And that is just how you lose the game at square one. And I don't mean lose the game like fail and go out of business. I just mean get it wrong. Like you're all day, every day, people are just in the wrong headspace to do the best work. And they activate that system startlingly intentionally, right? Business also ignores the notion that people are not similar to each other and that people have radically differing intrinsic motivation. And they pretend that people that are deeply uncreative human beings will magically wake up and do the first day of creative work in their life next week. That is absurd. And they pretend that people that are extremely creative will wake up next week and be extreme pragmatists. And that's absurd. And then we have all these rhythms and practices, 360 reviews, et cetera, that kind of tumble over this problem that you're ignoring that human beings are actually dissimilar at the root level. Like if you have two kids, you know that human beings are not similar, period. If you have siblings, you know that human beings are not similar. There's not a shred of evidence in your entire life that human beings are meaningfully similar creatures. And then we treat them as that, we got 6 engineers. It doesn't matter we have 6 engineers. It matters that we have engineer A, B, C, D, E, right? They're different people. The way they'll do it is different. We employ ineffective and counterproductive mantra like fail faster. Shreyas and I had a little fun on LinkedIn this week talking about that. These phrases activate stupidity in the human brain and rationalize bad action in the human brain, and we cling to them. And fail faster is the most ironic approach, right? Most ironic phrase in the universe, because the business world has been using it for 10 years and it hasn't begun working. So it's like fail faster is a case of fail faster, not working and not learning. So it's really fascinating that we do this. And then finally, we do believe and promote complete fabrications, figments of our imagination and factual inaccuracies within our teams. And people actually, if they are miseducated, of course, they will come up with weird ideas and weird strategies. So I think it's critically important that we make this knowledge more accessible. And this is kind of my appeal to convince people that it's really critical to have this knowledge in our own heads and in our team's heads, or we will kind of try to fly by dressing up like a bat, and it doesn't really work. So here's the rubber meeting the road from a business sense. Now, this kind of stack of behaviors actually creates ranges of performance that your company will perform inside of, or your team will perform inside of. And I think of the top of this range as something you can think of as like the ceiling of your performance. That is your maximum potential as a team and as a business. And every team, it's hard to know exactly where that ceiling is, but we all know like we are not operating at our absolute max best thinking, execution, results, et cetera. We know there's something up there that we could reach for. When it comes to the floor, that's often something we also call our goal, right? Which means below this floor of performance, we start to experience substandard results. We start to experience failure. We miss goals, we miss targets, we miss quarter earnings, we miss whatever But what we see is that this is when we start using Batman stuff instead of stuff that is technically good enough to reach our goal. And then we have all this space between our floor and our ceiling. And typically our performance will sit somewhere in this range, right? And it could sit underneath this floor at times. But most of our process and our best practices, the things that we employ and rationalize, are designed to keep us above the floor, right? And when we measure our performance, most teams measure their performance as the delta between where failure begins and where their performance was. Does that make sense? That is not how high-performing individuals and teams think. This is the way they measure performance. They try to understand how close we got to what was possible. That is a huge paradigm shift. So when I was at Adobe, we would high five. We'd have a year where we grew 30%, and they'd say our goal was 20%, and we grew 30%, and that's fantastic. Yeah, but the industry grew at 60%. And we are the number one player in the industry. So we performed at 50% of what the industry said our potential was. That's pathetic. That's not good. So our high-fiving using the typical measurement paradigm was literally causing us to quit on doing better, right? It was like satiating our appetite for performance instead of helping us understand, while our customers were not happy, right? They were saying, we need to be better. This doesn't work for me. This process of user management is awful. I can't find my data here. I like all this stuff. And I don't mean to beat up on them too much, but we clearly were not operating near our ceiling. And we were getting all that qualitative feedback, and yet the stock price was doing fine. Our financial stuff exceeded our very conservative goals, and we performed at half of the industry level, and we were giving each other high fives. And I personally didn't love that. So that's what makes me so charged up about this idea that let's set a new goal for ourselves. And I can't put this in your head. This is your choice to make. But I think if you have a new goal in mind for yourself and your team, that all of what we do is about getting to the ceiling, I think you can perform at a higher level, and I think you'll feel differently about your work, a lot better about your work. I think you'll also be able to clarify and explain to your team why we're getting better, even when we're doing well, right? Because there's headroom. It's good for our careers. It's good for us as people. It's fulfilling. And maybe they'll resist it at the first time, but when they actually do get better and they feel like higher performing human beings, that feeling of fulfillment, you're literally biologically designed to be rewarded for getting better. So I think it's really important to have the team feel that. So how do we get there? I think the science gives us the blueprints, really cool blueprints for how to get there. So here's kind of the thesis to walk away with in this kind of convincing yourself phase. I think science does a really good job of explaining why the best teams are so good. It actually does an even better job of explaining why the not best teams are not the best, right? It's really super clear because human performance is easily degraded, right? If you think about you're having a perfectly fine day, everything's fine, and then something negative enters your day, an actual real problem, your brain downgrades readily, really readily. If you're having a not so good day and then good stuff starts happening, your brain doesn't upgrade readily, right? It doesn't go upwards in performance as quickly as it goes downwards. And the same thing applies to even relationships and stuff like that. A relationship can get worse a lot faster than it can get better. And understanding how the mind works and how people work is really critical, because you have to understand that the downside stakes are high. And that's why science does such a good job of explaining all the stuff we need to really not do, because it's so easy to take human beings out of this high performance state. So science is showing what's going on deeper down, not just at the surface of people's behavior. I'm so envious of Shreyas's ability to articulate this better than me. I like he talks all the time about it's not about what people do, it's about how they think. And I try to say the same thing, and my words come out much worse. So if he's more convincing than I am, then read what he says instead of me. But he's right, and I think I'm right, and I think science is right, that it is not about what people do, it's about how people think. And when we look at this concept of deeper down, we've got this like iceberg mentality, right? So at the surface, we can see what people do. And then underneath the surface, there's their mind. And the mind is so complex and so big and so infinite. But the problem is we have it upside down. This whole paradigm is wrong. The brain versus like how people think versus what people do. What people do is, oh, here's all the things you should do and not do. Here's all the things you should say and not say. Here's all the things we should project as our brand and our presence, and don't do these things. And here's the way we should think and not think, and we should follow this process and use this framework and say these words and ask these questions as product people to get the best insights. We should score our different priorities and options these ways and create relationships and copy these people and companies. And that's a whole bunch of shit. Versus underneath the surface, it's just use your head better, use your brain better. And the brain is super finite. Let me show you why. It's much easier because all the stuff that we do, our brain produces ideas, it makes decisions, it seeks comprehension, it learns, it communicates, it comes up with creative ideas, it has curiosity, creates and manages relationships, it feels resilience or not. It focuses well or poorly and gets distracted. It has risk tolerance and all that stuff. All that comes down to 5 different parts of the brain in a recipe. So the first part on the left is the thalamus. That's our attention and our focus. If you have a hard time ignoring your phone's notifications, it's because you have not tamed your thalamus. If you're in the middle of a conversation with your team and people get distracted by a Slack message that comes in, it's because they have not managed their thalamus, and they must learn to manage their thalamus. And when they do, every single one of the things above this line gets better. And the next part is the amygdala, the fight or flight response, emotionality, mostly negative emotionality, but some positive. And if a person freaks out, gets threatened, gets triggered, gets whatever by something that actually shouldn't be that powerful of a stimulant, that's worse for everything above. And if they can learn to manage that and be aware of it, everything above gets better. The third part here is called the hippocampus. It's responsible for memory recall. It's also responsible for recording memory. And again, if you can actually kind of productively consider but ignore your memory, everything above gets better. Meaning, this is how we've done it before, is what your memory will say. But this next part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, will do it better than you did it before, because it will notice the nuance and the logical twists that you need to navigate. In this case, while your hippocampus will just remember what you did before. And it will treat all the new stuff and the nuance and these details and differences as anomalies that you should ignore or should be threatened by, while the prefrontal cortex will be delighted in solving that problem. And then I put this picture of a sea fan because I couldn't find one of these blue pictures of the anterior insular cortex, but it kind of looks like a sea fan tucked in behind the prefrontal cortex here. So I figured, we'll get by with that for this deck. But again, that's the compassion center of your brain. And if you are thinking about people other than yourself, every single thing above the line gets better. And it really is that simple. Manage your attention, manage your threat response and the threat response you cause in others. Manage your memory, use your logic and creativity, use your compassion, and everything above the line gets better. Misuse the bottom row, and you get all the problems you've ever seen above that line fundamentally come from misuse of those things on the bottom row. So here's the way we teach people, and I want to share a couple things with you today. I love this Feynman quote that guided how he would teach. That the purpose of learning is to truly understand things, not to memorize things. And you should understand things at the principles level, not kind of at the formulaic recipe level. So that's again about, it's not about what people do, the formulas and recipes they have. It's about the principles they understand and their ability to apply them to real life situations. So the first idea I wanted to share today is about the anatomy of performance. So these ideas, this part of your brain, these parts of your brain, you have a literal anatomical set of tools that determine your performance as a human being. And if you use different parts of your brain, you get different outcomes. So if I ask you to use your memory to answer the question, let's make something up. What is the best restaurant in New York City for me to go to with my family? You will use your memory to figure out your favorite restaurant and tell me. If I ask you to use your logic to answer that question, however, then you'll say, well, how old are your kids? What kind of food do they like? What do you dislike? What kind of experience do you want to have? How many days do you have? How much do you want to spend? So you'll try to figure out, instead of your memory coming up with this answer, logic is going to go through a very different process to generate that same answer. So when you ask your team, what should our highest priority be this quarter? Well, memory might serve them, well, these things work from the standpoint of ROI best. We've done these things in the past. But compassion would suggest, well, our documentation is terrible and people hate using our tool because of it. Or your logic might suggest that the greatest value in our tooling is actually some meta tooling that allows people to gather more insights from the data they get out of our system. So you can get different answers from one brain by using different parts of the anatomy. Now, who knows what this path is called? I don't know if anybody's allowed to unmute.
People can unmute.
Okay.
Yeah. If anybody knows the answer. I know I don't.
If we were a UX team, we would know the answer. The answer is called a desire path. And we see this in software, for example, that we may design an information architecture with various ways of getting to your account, but there's definitely certain ways that people would much rather get there than others, or get to the shopping cart or whatever. The desire path is the user saying, I don't want to go that way. I want to go this way. And the point here is every single brain has desire paths in them. So if we look at these 7 regions of the brain, kind of unpacking logic and creativity into 2 and adding this center for trust, who wants to take a guess at the primary desire path in most human brains? Where do most brains want to take everything first?
Any guesses? Can people unmute? If you can't, please add in the chat.
I would say safety.
Yes, exactly right. The strongest desire path in the human brain is to prioritize safety. As you hear or see or read anything, even this deck, part of your safety system might be like, oh, I hope somebody doesn't see this because they'll find out I'm doing it wrong or something like that. It's like we have a way of bending everything in our reality into safety. And when we're in meetings and somebody says something, right, like we get all these responses from people. And that's because of the strength of this desire path in the brain. You're asking them to think with some resilience and some logic and some creativity and open-mindedness. And what do you get instead? Bam, you find yourself right in the middle of a safety response. Who wants to guess the second strongest desire path in the brain?
Recall?
Yes, exactly right. So we like things that match patterns we know, that are familiar, etc. And the third is novelty, which is why we are interrupted by our notifications and people stop paying attention in the middle of meetings and things like that. If we had to say top row, bottom row, where does good product work occur?
Of course, in the bottom row.
Bottom row.
Yeah, exactly right. So the strongest pathways in the human brain, in the nominal human brain, you'll meet weird humans like me. I'm a weird human. I'll volunteer myself, whose desire paths are wired a little differently. Like for me, I really love compassion and logic. My brain just goes there as fast as possible, even if it presents a risk to me, if it's unfamiliar and maybe not even that interesting. I'm pulled there. And maybe you all are pulled to different places too. But you must recognize that if you're not a nominal brain, it doesn't matter that you're anomalous. This is what the actual nominal brain will do most of the time. And if you have a diverse team of different personalities, this is why product work can be so tough, because people want to keep doing what's safe, what's familiar, and what's interesting. And that is not how we build good products. We build good products using the tools on the bottom row. which requires that we get past or ignore the systems in our brain at the top. And that's kind of a delicate way of doing that. But I think the first thing to do with your team here as a takeaway is ask them, just like I did a second ago, what part of your brain is this coming from? And then ask them to answer from the part you want an answer from. It's literally that simple. So you say, I think this might be coming from your recall center, from your memory, because you just said we did this before, this worked before, when I was at Google, we did it this way. So that's your recall. Logically explain it to me. Give me the same answer through the lens of logic instead of recall. And you'll be blown away at how readily people can change how they think. Or if somebody's having this safety response and you say, okay, great, it feels risky, logically describe the risk to me. And you will watch some people do a great job of that. And you'll watch other people go, actually, logically, it's not that risky. And they'll work it out for themselves in a matter of minutes. It's enormous. It's an enormous impact just to go down to the brain. So if we think about this desire path that we have kind of wants to be like, no, I don't want to use any of the smart parts of my brain. So if Einstein's on this longer path and all of our best thinking comes from over here, the desire path is actually like, I'm going to go this way. I'm not going to talk to that weird guy over there. And that's what you're going to realize in your own team, sometime in our own minds. You're going to realize this in finance for sure. Finance doesn't ever want to talk to Einstein. You're going to realize this in engineering. You're going to realize this in everybody around you. And this is our challenge, is we have to overcome the primary desire paths of the human brain, which, by the way, exist not just for safety, but for calorie conservation. Our brains are designed to consume less energy so that we can actually save calories and not exhaust ourselves. But we have access to calories now, so we shouldn't be conserving them. We should be using them. So again, with Feynman, with this quote of understanding instead of memorizing, can you see why so many people want tips and tricks and how-tos? Their desire path wants you to build familiarity in their brain, and it doesn't want to actually do the hard thinking of understanding and comprehending. So it's the primary kind of switch to flip in the brain to basically say, this impulse that I have to go the easy way, the low-calorie way, is also interfering with my ability to actually comprehend and learn things. So 95% of people, here's the problem that we're going to face. They think that they know what their brain is doing. Self-awareness is kind of a form of being aware, being metacognitive about what your mind wants to do and your ability to kind of steer within that. But the truth is, data shows, the research shows that only 10 to 15% of people actually are aware that their unique mind thinks a certain way, that these desire paths exist, and that they are presently succumbing to them. So it's really important to help people become aware that this anatomy is real, and it will try to bend your thinking. And when you feel it doing it, that's what self-awareness is, to say, I'm not going to go with the familiar or the safe or the novel right now. I'm going to think logically. I'm going to think creatively. And if we can teach that to our teams, we essentially unlock that top tier of performance near the ceiling of our ability. So some questions to ponder here. I have another section to go through, but I'm going to stop here because you can see the next section on your own. So we have some time for Q&A. If there is a little time to dive back in, let's do that. But I definitely want to field some questions on this first part, because just this one tool can transform the ability for you to talk to people and navigate decisions. So the first question to ask yourself and your team, if you want to bring this to them, how strong are these desire paths in what we see day to day within our team and also with the teams we work with? Did we see these desire paths in our partners, in our executives, et cetera? What is the game plan? How can we learn how to steer the thinking inside of people's heads so we can use the smart, better parts of the brain instead of succumbing to the desire to use the dumber parts of the brain to solve our really complex problems? And what would happen, hypothetically, if you were to kind of think from an ROI perspective? How much impact would it really make if our team could use our minds better and lean into logic, trusting each other, thinking more compassionately about the user and each other, and thinking more creatively and designing more interesting experiences for people? So that's kind of the first lesson. And I'll just kind of page you through what else I wanted to show you, which is along with the anatomy, you have this concept of chemistry. Let me get rid of all my little helpers here. And the chemistry really is about that your brain is a pretty gnarly drug dealer, and it's going to dump 6 major chemicals into your head all the time: serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, endorphin, adrenaline, and cortisol. And these drugs, what I can talk through here in a minute if we want to spend some time on it, is they create a physiological response in the host organism. If a human brain has a bunch of dopamine in it, physiologically, that brain will start to feel desire. It will start to narrow its focus on getting the reward, getting the thing that it seeks. It will become transactional, meaning that rewards are a form of transaction. Like, I will do X in order to get Y. So if you hear people saying that's not my job, or what will I get, or whatever, it's actually a dopaminergic response that they're feeling. And it's also self-centered. So we don't necessarily, this is what I talked about, the system actions mismatch. Very, very many companies pack tons of dopamine into people's heads and bodies, and then expect them to be engaged, feel obligated, be curious and intellectual, insist on being effective and having impact, doing great work, being resilient to tolerate discomfort. They want them to kind of have intellectual confidence and be in a problem-solving mode, but they have put a chemical into the host organism that does the opposite of many of those things, or at least contorts those things from, this tolerance of discomfort is high if it matches the desire, but the tolerance for discomfort is negative if there's no reward attached. And the same thing with the fight or flight response. When we make people stressed out or make people freaked out, they feel fear and the need to escape. They resort to expedience, like kind of fast, reckless, careless action and impulsivity. They seek retaliation. We're good at that as a species. And we also experience up to 30% cognitive decline. If you take an IQ test while you are high on adrenaline and cortisol, you will score 30% lower on the IQ test. So this is the stuff that's going on inside the body and the mind. And what science knows about us as humans and as teams is really amazing. We have all this stuff about why we make the choices we make through all these different layers of cognitive use of decision making, et cetera, all the way up to why we even feel purpose, which is really, really cool stuff. So I'll stop there. We'll maybe shift to some Q&A and discussion. And if there's an appetite, maybe we could spin up some other session to talk about the rest, or talk with me individually, whatever the case might be. But let's field some questions.
Thank you, Evan. Actually, there were quite a few questions about on the slide with the 7 boxes, the 7 circles.
Okay.
Let's go in the order. Siddharth, do you want to ask your question directly, or I can read it for you?
I can ask. I was sort of wondering, Evan, if those processing centers, and it's kind of some of the wording sort of reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I was trying to see whether there's like and especially even with the answers, right, thinking about safety and all those. So trying to figure out if there's a correlation there that you could perhaps elaborate on.
Between Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yeah, because somehow some of the wording and all sort of, that's kind of what came to my mind when I was looking at that slide. I'm trying to see if there is any kind of correlation there.
I mean, it's a near perfect correlation. So remember when Maslow made the hierarchy of needs, he didn't have an MRI handy. So basically what he, and even going back to Carl Jung in cognitive functions and what essentially turned into Myers-Briggs, these were all constructed by geniuses observing the deepest observation possible coming from the brain. So thinking about like extroverted thinking, this kind of using extrinsic data to rationalize things, which is one of Carl Jung's functions. He was basically describing what's going on with the need to pack the hippocampus with empirical knowledge, referenceable knowledge, and proof in order to feel a sense of security that something is correct. Which is why your CFO will always ask what the ROI of stuff is, even when you're talking about documentation, which is creating nth order effects instead of first order effects, right? It's an illogical question to use your 8-crayon box of financial vocabulary to try to understand our 16.7 million colors of human experience, right? Like it's a huge mismatch. So that's kind of what's going on. And if you look at the hierarchy, you'll find that things that are the baseline needs are those degradation scenarios that I talked about, that if that need becomes unmet, it essentially becomes cognitively impossible to seek the needs that are higher in the hierarchy, because your brain will downgrade to a mode to seek safety, stability, security, connection, all this stuff deeper down in the hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Cool. Thank you, Evan.
Yep. Great question.
Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to know more about the differences between novelty and creativity, as I think I would have associated them together, since creativity will, bring you towards novel ideas. But yeah, can you explain a little more about that?
So novelty is the physiological response to creativity. Novelty is like super caveman level stuff. So if you go in a place and they're shooting laser lights around and there's music and your brain's going, ooh, ah, nothing intellectual is happening in your brain. Your brain's just impressed, and it's putting its attention on that stuff. Now, creativity is the generative piece of that, which is, what does it take to make a brain make those laser light shows and that music and that stuff? That's what actual creativity is generating that stuff that hopefully will create a novelty response in other people's brains and attract those brains to what you've made.
One follow-up. Let's say that you're trying to get into a creative headspace, and then you are coming up with ideas that produce a novelty response in your own head. Does that then shift you out of creative mode? And is it like, how can you stay in creative mode when you can, I guess, come up with novel ideas that could bring you down a road that maybe isn't the best road to go down?
I think you can look at that as the flight simulator in your head, to be like, especially if you're like a comedian, is a good example, right? Where if Dave Chappelle's joke makes Dave Chappelle laugh, he's like, okay, there's signal there. I even like that. But he also has to realize that I have a broader audience, so my own novelty system isn't enough to gauge the interest of all the different things I'm making. So how can I also leverage compassion and logic to understand what's going to appeal more broadly to people? And I think what you run into this, one of the places you run into this is kind of ironic. It's like this ironic inversion of novelty, where really pragmatic people don't believe in the value of design. They're like, let's just slap it together, get it done, etc. And you're like, did you like, A Few Good Men? And they're like, oh, I love that. Yeah, you loved it because it was novel and creative, right? Like, they don't even understand that their brain loves and craves novelty, but they're so pragmatic that their kind of creativity centers of their brain are almost non-functioning, and they ascribe not just zero value to creative output, but negative value in the sense that it's wasted energy and time and cycles. And the debate's over. Having another conversation with another human in 2024 about the value of design, we've done this millions of times with millions of other humans. You should just go read some of that stuff, because we're not going to do it again with you. So of course we are, but that's maybe some of the backtrack that you can have in your mind.
Rachel, why don't you also ask your second question, and then we'll go to Sujay. I'm sure many people have the same question in mind.
Yeah, so I'm asking about tools or techniques to kind of stop you in the moment and bring you from those upper row processing centers to the bottom row. Like, how, as human beings, can we remember at the right time to be aware and shift our focus? And how can we train teams to do the same thing?
Yeah, so I think this is where the shared vocabulary piece is so critical. And you can certainly start with yourself privately and just spend a few days or even weeks getting better at this. So be like, okay, I've got these 7 processing centers. They're very real things. Can I start to feel them and name them in my head as I go through my day? So I read an email, boom, there's the safety center popped on. I get distracted and start doing something else, boom, there was my novelty system. I watch a person do something in a meeting and insist that we do it the way we were doing it before, that's their familiarity system. So just kind of start to become a little more adept at mapping the feelings and thoughts you have and the things you can observe in others to these processing centers, and say like, okay, I know where in the brain their thinking is occurring. And I don't know if I can't remember if I shared this on Lenny's or not, but like the college campus metaphor is a good metaphor to have in mind for this too, which is basically like, which department of the campus are we in right now? So, yeah, is this coming from the history department? And that's all we're listening to right now is a bunch of old knowledge from the past. Or are we hearing from the art department and we're thinking creatively and kind of outside of the boundaries of limitations? Start to understand like what department stuff is coming from and realize it's often very distinct. It's coming from one place, can be coming from a mix. Then in the team, I think it's just the same thing. It's just there are 7 things that can happen in our head that generate different types of thinking. And the mechanism that I use with people is really simple, which is like, I think I might be wrong, but I think this is coming from your brain's need for safety. Can you please tell me, can you just answer the exact same question using your logical center instead? So if somebody's like says a very kind of casual phrase like, that's risky, or I disagree, that's wrong, that's dumb, whatever, be like, okay, the prefrontal cortex would never say any of those things. That's not the sentence it would form. You know, the prefrontal cortex doesn't say I disagree. It would say, I'm not sure I follow this logic right here in this particular part, right? It would show that it's thinking logically. Whereas I disagree is like my hippocampus says I don't have exactly the same answer to that prompt. So start with like, it seems like where it's coming from. I would like it to come from here. And then train your team. And then at the meta level, have some reviews with the team and be like, here are the patterns in the places it seems like stuff is coming from. Here are the consistent requests that we're making of each other for it to come from somewhere else. And have you noticed how much better the answers are when it comes from a better part of the brain? And if you can start to notice that, then you can stop yourself from like blah when the instinctive part of your brain wants to generate an answer. And you can even show like a metacognitive answer, which is to say something like, okay, my impulse is to say this, but let me give it some more thought and unpack that with you. And a team that does that will have conversations that kind of it feels fast to people to say, I disagree. It's really slow to say, I disagree, and then get through that. If instead you unpack, like my impulse is to disagree, but it's really deeper down because of this, 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 and this, that conversation will happen in maybe 10% of the time that the I disagree conversation will happen in. And this is where we get faster. It's why the F-35 goes faster, because it's being bigger at first makes the whole thing smaller overall. Being small at first and reactive makes the conversation bigger overall.
Thank you.
Cool. Does that help? Is that a good enough answer?
Yeah, I hope I can do it. Sounds amazing.
You can definitely do it. Absolutely. It's no question.
So, wait,
Ryan, I know you have a question. I want to quickly, oh, sorry, Mahib, were you saying something?
yes, please. I wanted to do a quick time check. I believe there are a lot of interesting questions remaining. So
Yeah.
we can shift this up a little bit. Let's use the 5 more minutes remaining to answer maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And if folks would still like, I would like to see some thumbs up here. If folks would still like to do breakouts after that, we could stop the recording at the top of the hour and just allow 15 minutes of breakouts, and folks can say bye-bye from there on. So please let me know how you would like to do. I would like to see some thumbs up if you would still like to have breakouts and small group meetup after at the top of the hour. And we could allow 15 minutes for that.
Okay.
Okay.
So while people are responding,
Yeah.
I will move on to the next question because we have just 5 minutes. Ryan, I see you have a question, but let me first go to Sujay to make sure we get to his, and then Ryan will come back to yours. So Sujay, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Farooq. Lovely hearing you, Evan. So I'm actually dialing in from India. It's like almost 30 minutes closer to the midnight.
Oh my
But
goodness.
lovely listening to you. So I was kind of interested to understand. I think you've covered it in the previous questions itself. But kind of circumstances and the environment in which the decision needs to be made. I was trying to understand that if that plays a part. And the second follow-up question was what techniques could be used to kind of come out of it and, think like a rational, think rationally. And you answered the second one in the previous question itself, but, you're just putting it out there.
Yeah. So is the first question, if I understand it correctly, kind of like acknowledging the habitat we're inside of while we're trying to do these things?
Correct. I mean, the thing was, think about safety or logic, right? When the mind is stressed, you don't think about safety, you think about logic, how to get out of it, right? And when your mind is calm, you don't think about, you think the other way around, right? So was interested to understand your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think there is this is where the tool breaks up into a few pieces, and we have to acknowledge that real life makes things complicated sometimes, and certainly people make things complicated sometimes. So you probably work with at least a few people that really want to use those desire paths. And I kind of think if we break this up into pieces, that one of the pieces has to be considering whether or not we've created a platform to justify why we want to take people off the desire path, so that it doesn't just look like a personal preference in terms of I'd rather us think about this creatively, compassionately, and logically instead of impulsively and fast. It actually is something we can reference, some principle or some goal that we have in mind or some agreement that we have in mind that justifies why it's objectively better to do it, not just your opinion versus mine. I'm actually having a Maven course on this, which if you're in India, don't come next Friday. It's super late for you. But I'm talking about how to sell yourself and your ideas. And we're starting with the idea that unless you've done the groundwork at the macro level of positioning yourself and creating the platform for this stuff, you're really going to struggle at the micro level as you try to nudge people in certain directions, warn people of things, get your ideas said yes to, et cetera. So if people think product management is just talking to customers and reprioritizing the backlog, and that's like their macro perception of you, then all the micro stuff you're going to try to do is on this platform of weakness, and it's going to make it really hard. So I'd say the first answer to your question is start to think through your positioning, your branding, the fundamental first principles that drive what you do as a business, and negotiate with people about those first, or even in the moment to kind of say, all right, I know we feel panicked and we're in a rush and we want to move as fast as possible and at the principal level, but we also do spend a lot of time picking up the pieces of our mistakes around here. So can we agree that adding 10 or 20% more time to us thinking about this, or 20% more like intellect to this question might produce 5x the result? And are we willing to do that? And I think that's the stuff that builds the platform to kind of say, we just agreed that we're going to spend 10% more energy on this, so please do it, right? And push people through that. I think I'm trying to kind of leave enough dynamics in the room, but again, it's about using the relationship that you have, the trust that you have, the context that you have, the importance of the decision. Try to create some objective reference point as to why we should not be using our limbic system to make this decision, like the dumb parts of our brain, why we should be using the prefrontal cortex and the smart parts of our brain to make this decision. Does that give you enough to get started, or you want more detail?
No, I think these are good points to start with. Thanks.
All right, we have 1 minute left. Ryan, let's go with your question.
I'm trying to break this down as a neurology question, Evan, but I'm hearing you describe an arbiter. Some part of your brain is actually choosing which part of the brain to use. And if I think of it only as the component parts, it's not one of those component parts that's necessarily the arbiter. They're like the function. So who's the arbiter in this story?
So the arbiter is actually based on neurological pathways. So there's a very literal pathway in your brain that essentially goes, okay, if anything hits your optic nerve or it comes through your ears as sound, the first place it will go is thalamus, which is why when you hear a branch snap in the woods, it creates this physiological need to focus your attention on that anomalous sound. Or, all sorts of cool stuff happens in the brain. From the thalamus, it is hardwired to then activate the amygdala and the hippocampus next to recall memory and understand, okay, that is a branch. I've been in these woods before. All the memory context to help you evaluate that situation will generally activate I think it's about 175 milliseconds if I'm correct about the timeline there. The amygdala response actually outpaces that by about 20x. So your physiological stress or freakout response will spike about a second and a half before your memory will even know what happened, will recognize the thing, which is where it's so dangerous in teams to like say something threatening that depends on them interpreting it like through this you know what I mean lens, because they've already had the physiological cortisol norepinephrine response well before their brain even knows who you are saying it, which is really fascinating, or why it would make sense for you to say it. And then from there, we start to activate the prefrontal lobe. That prefrontal cortex doesn't distinctly get turned on or off. It's responsible for all the arbiting from that point forward, minus the chemical responses that predispose everything else. So if we've had a cortisol response, a lot of these neurological pathways are like traffic copped at that point, like send everything this way that you possibly can. But you're still using, there's a part right below the smart part of your prefrontal cortex, just above your eyes, that's responsible for the relative value of choices and decisions. So you could be like, okay, I have 3 choices here. What's the highest value choice to make? This is the one. It actually does that kind of Vegas odds management in your head. And I've got a whole bunch of other kind of slides and stuff that teach people like, how does your brain generate those choices, value those choices, and select those choices, which is really, really key. But like, there's a very literal sequence that occurs between that attention management, then the threat management, then the memory piece. And that kind of is what, it's almost like unzipping a file in your brain. Like that's what unpacks the rest of the arbiter system, this kind of prefrontal cortex ability to start weighing options and seeing them.
I guess that's where the follow-on session might be, as like a strong request would be, how do I strengthen that system?
Yeah,
You know,
that's the objective.
cortisol aside, like cops run into the scene, I get it. But then when I do get the opportunity to override, you know, jobs to be done, I want to be in that driver's seat, because I do find for myself and people that report to me, it's just reactive. So it's very hard
Absolutely.
to strengthen the muscle to override the systems.
Yep. And that's why I kind of referenced in the previous answer the habitat. I think it's really important to not think, your brain doesn't realize that you're in a company or in a meeting. It knows you're in a habitat, like a jungle with a lion in it. Like it knows how to kind of achieve symbiosis with its environment. So if your habitat is highly causal and predisposes people for the arbiter to be reactive and be impulsive, then you're trying to overcome a really deep biological obstacle. You must fix the habitat first so that the brain can acclimate and realize this is the kind of place where I don't have to be reactive. So it's really important to kind of create those bubbles, whether they're small or large in your organization, and try to operate inside of a habitat first, not try to get this system action mismatch problem where the habitat has predisposed us to stress, and then we're trying to get actions from purpose and thoughtfulness to come out of humans. We are playing the lowest probability game we possibly can at that point. Great question.
Thank you, Evan. That's been quite a topic, as we can judge from the engagement during the Q&A. This opens more questions, right? It's thoughtful, it's thought provoking. Definitely more questions open than answered. So thank you very much. I mean, I took away. I was trying to take notes. I took away so many practical insights, as I'm sure our audience did. So thank you again. What we can do is we can stop recording at this time.